The marble corridors of the imperial palace had become a place of sudden confusion. Courtiers moved too fast for protocol, doors opened and shut without announcement, and Rome's political center, usually so careful about appearances, seemed to lose its script. Beyond curtains and colonnades, senators spoke in low voices about restoring the republic, as if a century of imperial government could be reversed by a vote, an oath, and sheer nostalgia. A dynasty had ruptured in an instant, and the city waited, not for calm, but for whatever decision came next from men with weapons and authority. In a cramped space behind a hanging drape half-storeroom, half-hiding place, a man pressed himself into shadow and tried to become unnoticeable. He was no general, no celebrated orator, no magnetic favorite of the court. For most of his life he had been treated as an embarrassment, a relative to be tolerated rather than honored, mocked and pitied in equal measure. Yet in the vacuum left by a sudden removal at the top, the forgotten man became the most strategically valuable person in the empire. When soldiers found him, they did not treat him as a target. They raised him up, and Rome, still reeling from Pallas upheaval, suddenly belonged to a man who had spent his life being told he would never belong to anything at all. Claudius' story began not with triumph, but with survival, and with a question the city had avoided since Augustus. What happened when power fell into the hands of the one person no one had prepared to wield it? The world that shaped Claudius spoke the language of the Republic while living under something else. Rome still performed its ancient rituals, consuls, senatorial decrees, the inherited dignity of old families, and yet the center of gravity had shifted to a single household. Augustus had constructed that new order with care, disguising monarchy behind tradition and teaching Rome to accept a master without admitting it had done so. The compromise held as long as the emperor appeared to govern in partnership with the Senate, and in deference to custom, but the mask thinned with each successor. Under Tiberius, suspicion became a governing instrument. Informers thrived, prosecutions multiplied, and the aristocracy learned that an incautious remark could be reframed as disloyalty to the state. The emperor himself withdrew, ruling from a distance while anxiety filled the space he left behind. After him came Gaius, Caligula, brilliant, theatrical, volatile, a reign remembered in ancient sources as a blend of spectacle and dread, where the court's laughter often sounded like self-preservation. At the heart of the capital stood the Praetorian Guard, created to protect the emperor and now capable of selecting one. Stationed within Rome, armed, organized, and close enough to act before the Senate could fully coordinate, it had become a political force in its own right. The empire's supreme office could be presented through public ceremonies, but it could also be decided in barracks, corridors, and secured through negotiated loyalty beyond the city. Roman power ran along roads and rivers, across mountain passes and seas. From the Atlantic to the Euphrates, provinces fed Rome with grain and taxes and, in return, received order often delivered through military pressure and the hard reality of occupation. The Senate's proud houses still believed themselves the rightful stewards of the state, yet they lived under emperors who held command of armies and control of appointments. It was an age of performance and risk, where legitimacy was staged and survival depended on instinct as much as birth. Into this unstable world, poised between tradition and autocracy, Claudius was born an heir to the ruling house who seemed, from the beginning, unsuited to rule at all. That assumption shaped his childhood, narrowed his opportunities, and when the palace turned dangerous, helped keep him alive. Tiberius Claudius Drusus was born in 10 BCE at Lugdunum in Gaul, a city that still carried the scent of fresh stone and Roman ambition. His family was the dynasty itself. On one side stood the Claudi, an old patrician line famed for severity. On the other stood the Julians, with the blood of Augustus woven into the new imperial myth. His father, Nero Claudius Drusus, had been a beloved general, dead young after campaigning beyond the Rhine. His mother, Antonia Minor, was the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, niece of Augustus, bearing within her household the tangled memory of civil war and reconciliation. But the child who inherited these names did not inherit their ease. Ancient sources describe Claudius as afflicted by physical difficulties, perhaps a limp, a tremor, a stammer, involuntary movements. Modern scholars debated the precise diagnosis and treated retrospective medical certainty with caution, since the surviving portraits often came from hostile or sensational testimony. What remained clear was the social consequence. In a household where image functioned as authority, difference was read as weakness. In Rome, perceived weakness invited contempt, and contempt could become a long-term political threat. He was kept from public life, where other boys of his rank were trained for command, displayed at ceremonies, and pushed toward offices that announced their future. Claudius was sheltered, sometimes ridiculed, and repeatedly underestimated, yet isolation became its own education. He read what warriors ignored. He studied history, law, and antiquarian lore with obsessive attention, and he wrote voluminously. Later accounts claimed on peoples and pasts that Rome used to define itself. The Etruscans, Carthage, the early city's institutions. He learned how power had been built, how it had been justified, and how it had failed. By the time he reached adulthood, he understood a lesson more valuable than rhetoric. In the imperial court, visibility could be hazardous. Men who shone brightly attracted rivals, denunciations, and sudden reversals of fortune. Claudius, dismissed as harmless, learned how to endure. He watched who entered rooms, who left them, and who did not return. He learned the difference between influence and authority, between titles granted as ornaments and titles granted as instruments. He learned, above all, that an emperor's household was not private life, but the engine room of the state. For decades he remained at the margins, a prince in name, but not in weight. Under Tiberius he received some honors enough to acknowledge his blood without raising him into danger. Under Caligula he was pulled closer and made consul, but ancient writers described his proximity as a kind of humiliation. He was displayed, mocked, turned into a prop in performances that reminded the court where power truly sat. Dignity could be reduced with a joke, and laughter could function as an imperial directive. Behind the ridicule, Claudius watched the machinery. Petitions, accusations, patronage, the distribution of favors, the way fear could be administered like policy. The court became a school, and he, the overlooked student, learned its curriculum. That education did not make him admired. It made him prepared. In January of 41 CE, the Pallas convulsed. Caligula was removed in a coordinated attack by officers of the Praetorian Guard, driven by grievances that combined personal insult, political desperation, and the destabilizing effect of an emperor widely viewed as unpredictable. The Senate rushed toward the dream of restoring the Republic, a dream that had become more incantation than plan. Debate rose in the Curia. Uncertainty spread through the streets. The empire needed a center, and it did not yet know where it would find one. It was in that vacuum that Claudius was discovered in concealment, whether behind a curtain, in a small room, or another hiding place varied by source, but the meaning held. In the palace, he had survived by being overlooked. Now he was seen. He was the closest adult male of the Julio-Claudian house, and bloodlines still carried the authority that speeches could not manufacture overnight. The Praetorians carried him to their camp and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate protested, hesitated, and argued over precedents, but deliberation moved slowly, and soldiers moved fast. Claudius stood between factions with no guarantee of leniency from either. He did what survival had taught him to do. He accepted the reality already forming around him. He authorized a donative to the guard, money and recognition, in exchange for loyalty and by securing his position through payment. He set a precedent later emperors could not ignore. Rome had not chosen him with clean ceremony. It had stumbled into him. The scholar who had lived under contempt now faced the most dangerous task imaginable, ruling an empire that did not forgive weakness, and proving that the man pulled from hiding could direct legions, senators, and the city's essential supply lines. His first struggle was legitimacy. He was emperor not because the Senate had elevated him, but because armed men had made a decision before the politicians could. To survive, he needed more than force. He needed the appearance of lawful continuity. He moved quickly to present himself not as a usurper but as a restorer. He emphasized connection to Augustus and spoke, at least in form, the language of partnership with the Senate. He offered stability after Caligula's volatility. Yet beneath the rituals, everyone understood the new reality. The Principate rested on control of the military and the management of political fear. Claudius governed with a diligence that surprised those who had laughed at him. He involved himself in administration, sat in judgment, heard cases, and attempted to impose order on a legal system strained by corruption and influence. Ancient accounts portrayed him as earnest, sometimes pedantic, occasionally vulnerable to manipulation, but also capable of sudden firmness. His attention to detail, sharpened by years of reading and observation, became a kind of authority in itself. He expanded the imperial administrative apparatus and relied heavily on imperial freedmen and household officials, men such as Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, whose proximity to him translated into power. Two senatorial families. This arrangement was a humiliation. Former slaves stood between aristocrats and the emperor's ear, controlling access, shaping decisions, handling correspondence, and managing finances. Hostile writers later used that fact to argue that Claudius was governed by others. From Claudius' perspective, these officials offered something senators could not reliably provide: direct loyalty and administrative competence, unburdened by ancestral rivalry. In an empire of vast distances and complex revenue streams, execution was not a minor virtue. It was governance. Yet every step he took to strengthen the palace bureaucracy widened the gap between emperor and aristocracy, deepening resentments that never fully disappeared. He also made decisions that redefined who could belong to Rome's ruling class. Claudius supported the inclusion of provincial elites into Roman political life, most famously by permitting notables from Gaul to enter the Senate, an act preserved in part by inscriptions and echoed sometimes with admiration, often with hostility in later literature. To old Rome, it felt like dilution of noble blood. To the empire, it was consolidation, binding distant territories to the center by granting their leaders a stake in the imperial system. He acted as though Rome was not merely a city ruling provinces, but an empire that had to become, in some measure, shared. But administration and reform could not, by themselves, quiet a question that followed him from the Praetorian camp. Could Claudius embody Roman greatness? For an emperor who had not secured power through a traditional military rise, martial achievement remained valuable political currency. In 43 CE he launched the conquest of Britain, an island that hovered at the edge of Roman imagination since Julius Caesar's expeditions, a place of myth and strategic value. Politically fragmented, yet symbolically potent, the invasion was led initially by Aulus Plautius, carrying Roman legions across the Channel into a landscape that offered no easy victory. Claudius traveled to Britain to take part in the campaign's culminating phase, associated in the sources with the capture of key strongholds and the receipt of triumphal honors. In public perception, the transformation was dramatic. The man drawn from concealment was now displayed as a conqueror. Rome minted the story into coinage, carved it into monuments, and repeated it in ceremony until it felt inevitable. Yet conquest produced its own consequences. A new province demanded garrisons, administration, money, and a steady supply of capable governors. Military prestige strengthened Claudius' position, but it also sharpened expectations and resentments. Senators who despised his freedmen now watched him claim glory that could not be dismissed as mere accident. The empire's edge expanded, and with it expanded the stress on the center, where succession, intimacy, and patronage still determined who lived close to power. If Claudius' public reign was defined by diligence and expansion, his private life became a battleground with state consequences. He was married to Valeria Messalina, much younger than he, and by her had children, including Britannicus, the boy many assumed would inherit. In the ancient sources, Messalina's name became a byword for scandal, extravagant infidelity, brazen ambition, ruthless intrigue. Modern historians treated the most sensational stories with caution, aware that hostile senatorial authors and later moralists often used prominent women as symbols of decadence and corruption. Yet even with skepticism, the political reality remained. Messalina stood at the center of patronage. Her household could elevate allies, ruin rivals, and shape the atmosphere in which accusations became weapons. Under Claudius, prosecutions and capital punishments increased in the heated environment of court politics. Some targets likely faced genuine conspiracies. Others may have been crushed by rivalries, sharpened by the emperor's reliance on intermediaries. Claudius could be methodical in judicial settings and energetic in administration, yet dangerously exposed inside his own palace, where information reached him, filtered through those who benefited from what he believed. The crisis arrived in 48 CE according to surviving accounts. Messalina entered into a public marriage ceremony with Gaius Silius, a prominent aristocrat, while Claudius was away at Ostia. Whether this was reckless personal conduct, a calculated bid for power, or a narrative amplified by hostile reporting remained debated. What was not debated was the regime's interpretation. The court treated it as an existential threat. An empress binding herself to another man could be read as an attempt to replace the emperor and redirect the succession. The response was immediate and irreversible. Narcissus, one of Claudius' most powerful freedmen, drove events presenting the situation as treason and pushing the state to act before hesitation could become fatal. Silas was put to death. Messalina was also put to death. Sources differed in tone about Claudius's personal resolve. Some emphasized reluctance, others necessity, but they agreed on the outcome. The palace was cleared of key figures, alliances snapped, and Claudius was left amid a collapse of trust, learning again what he had learned as a young man. In Rome, the most intimate betrayal could be political, and the most political danger could arrive through the household. Messalina's removal did not end the crisis. It intensified it. With the empress gone, the question of succession became urgent and perilous. Britannicus was still young. The empire had seen what happened when succession was unclear, when guards and senators competed to fill a vacuum. Claudius needed continuity, and in Rome continuity was often manufactured through marriage. One candidate rose above the rest. Agrippina the Younger, Claudius' niece, sister of Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus. Her bloodline was not merely noble. It was a strategic asset. She entered the palace with a cold understanding of how Rome worked and brought with her a son from a previous marriage. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy who would become Nero. To marry Agrippina required a rupture with Roman custom. An uncle marrying his niece was taboo in Rome, though royal households elsewhere had permitted similar unions. The Senate was induced to sanction it, an illustration of how tradition bent when imperial necessity demanded it. The act carried its own message. The emperor could shape not only armies and appointments, but even the boundaries of acceptable law. Once Empress Agrippina moved with deliberate purpose. She secured honors, built alliances, and positioned her son for power. Claudius adopted the boy, making him Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, elevating him in name and status. Nero was betrothed to Claudius' daughter Octavia, binding him deeper into the imperial line. Agrippina received the title Augusta, a rare distinction that signaled authority and shaped public perception. To some, it looked like prudent dynastic planning. the creation of an heir old enough to present a stable future while Britannicus matured. To others, it resembled a gradual capture of the throne by a new faction inside the palace. Claudius had learned to navigate senators, soldiers, and provincial governors. Now he faced a pressure more intimate than any public opposition, the possibility that his household was reordering the empire's future against the claims of his own son. In the early 50s, Claudius no longer appeared as the fragile outcast of his youth, nor merely as the bureaucrat temporar of his early reign. He had become, by Roman standards, an effective ruler. Britain was being absorbed into imperial administration. Roads and aqueducts, harbors and legal decisions strengthened the empire's arteries. He pursued major public works linked to the grain supply, including projects associated with the harbor at Pallas, meant to secure Rome against famine and civic unrest. Such engineering carried political weight. In Rome, bread was legitimacy, and shortages could unseat emperors faster than foreign threats. Yet success did not quiet the palace. It sharpened the stakes. The more Claudius built, the more urgent it became to decide who inherited what he had secured. Britannicus approached adolescence, the age when a boy could attract loyalty as a future emperor. If Claudius intended to restore his natural son's priority, it would threaten Agrippina's designs and imperil those who had invested their future in Nero's ascent. Ancient sources suggested that in Claudius' final months he showed signs of reconsideration, speaking favorably of Britannicus and expressing, at times, discomfort with the speed of Nero's elevation. Whether these reports reflected reality or were colored by later interpretation remained uncertain. But they fit the logic of court politics. A shift in succession would have amounted to open conflict within the household, and Rome's imperial household rarely contained such pressures without severe consequences. In October of 54 CE, Claudius died at 63. The cause became one of the most famous controversies of imperial history, not because it lacked explanations, but because it was entangled in rumor, propaganda, and the court's habit of suspecting covert methods in every transition. Many ancient writers claimed he had been poisoned, and Agrippina was often named as the organizer, with accounts focusing on contaminated mushrooms and, in some traditions, the notorious poisoner looked. Other possibilities included illness, age, and the ordinary dangers of ancient health. The sources were not unanimous, and their biases were apparent. Later historians, writing under subsequent regimes, had incentives to portray certain figures as villains and to explain political change through secret criminality. What could be said with confidence was that Claudius' death came at a moment favorable to Agrippina and Nero, and that the transition moved with remarkable speed. Nero was proclaimed emperor, the Praetorian Guard was secured, the Senate was brought into alignment. Britannicus remained alive for a time, but his position narrowed rapidly as the court reorganized around the new ruler. Claudius, who had risen through Pallas crisis and a soldier's proclamation, left the world in circumstances that echoed the dangers of his ascent. In Rome, power rarely changed hands. Without fear hardening into decisive action, the emperor who had labored to build stability became, in death, a bridge to another reign, one that would later push the Julio-Claudian house toward catastrophe and cast Claudius' memory into a shadowed, contested light. His legacy became a study in contradiction, and the contradictions were the shape of his life rather than accidents of interpretation. Ancient senatorial historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius often portrayed him as a man of oddities, learned yet overly trusting, diligent yet overshadowed, capable of justice yet surrounded by corruption. Their portraits carried aristocratic disdain for freedmen and deep suspicion of courts where access mattered more than pedigree. In that telling, Claudius became the emperor who was guided by others, a scholar in a throne room, a man who approved decisions without full control of the network around him. Yet the administrative record and the broad contours of his reign suggested a more formidable figure. Under Claudius, the imperial bureaucracy became more functional and centralized. Provincial integration advanced, binding elites beyond Italy to Rome's political core. Legal decisions and public works showed an emperor engaged with governance at a granular level, not merely delegating but participating. The conquest of Britain, whatever its immediate motivations, altered Rome's map and left an imprint that echoed for centuries. The historical debate often turned on agency. Claudius could be presented as a captive of Pallas factions, but he could also be understood as a pragmatic ruler who used the instruments available to him, freedmen administrators, legal reform, dynastic marriages, to maintain control in a system where open trust was dangerous. Both impressions could coexist. His outsider status and physical difficulties, which made him seem non-threatening, may have sharpened patience and attention, but they also isolated him and increased dependence on gatekeepers. Turning his strength in administration into a vulnerability in intimacy, he occupied a critical place in the evolution of the prince. His elevation by the Praetorian Guard and the donative that secured it underlined a truth Rome preferred not to say aloud. The supreme office rested not on republican legality, but on force and the management of force. Claudius tried to clothe that truth in law, ritual, and diligent governance. but the instrument beneath the cloth remained visible. If his reign proved that an underestimated man could rule effectively, it also proved that even effective rule could not fully domesticate the system that had produced it. In the end, Claudius mattered because he revealed how an empire functioned when its myths began to fray. He was not the hero Rome expected, nor the tyrant it feared most. He was something more unsettling to his contemporaries, a capable administrator whose greatest dangers came not from public incompetence, but from the intimate mechanics of power, family, succession, patronage, and the perilous closeness of those who served out in the smoke of his funeral rites. Claudius stood in a strange light. The same Rome that had laughed at him had watched him claim a triumph. The same Senate that had hesitated to accept him had learned to live with his bureaucracy and his laws. The same Pallas that had once sheltered him as an object of ridicule had become the instrument of his authority, and perhaps the place where his life ended under a cloud that history could never fully clear. He had been born into an imperial household at a time when the word republic was still spoken like a prayer. Even as power belonged to whoever held the legions and commanded the guard, he learned to endure contempt and fashioned from that endurance a reign, defined less by charm than by work. Petitions weighed, cases heard, provinces drawn closer to the center, grain secured, and stability performed until it resembled reality. His triumph had been real, and so had his vulnerability. He could send armies across the sea and attach new territory to Rome's dominion, yet struggled to command loyalties within his own home. The story that began with a man trembling in concealment ended with a truth the city never escaped. In an empire where legitimacy was staged and secured by force, the most unlikely ruler could become indispensable. Yet no ruler, however diligent, could ever fully tame the dangers of succession and proximity. Claudius did not claim the world through brilliance alone. He endured long enough to inherit it, worked hard enough to shape it, and trusted deeply enough to be exposed by it. In that paradox lay the final imprint of his life on imperial Rome. The throne did not always choose the strongest man, only the one still standing when the doors finally opened.